Teacher of this morning is Massimiliano Tomba. The title of this speech is Decentring Modern History, Pluralizing Time.
Thank you. Okay. So I have a paper, but I want to try not to read it because I think, first of all, when I read my papers, I think I am pretty boring, and we can have a better conversation if I try to summarize what is at stake in my paper. I will read only a few sentences. And first of all, what is the origin of the terms, the words synchronism and anachronism? And according to the historian Peter Bark in the book of The Renaissance Sense of the Past, 1969, the term synchronism was created in 16th century. He said that the first occurrence of the term synchronism was 1589. And it was created in order to emphasize the coherence between disparate events happening at the same time. I think it's important because the concept of synchronism is related to the modern concept of history. And then we have the opposite concept, anachronism, that was created in order to designate a time out of place. A time, if you want, that is incongruous with the present. So in my presentation, in my speech, I want to introduce other two concepts. The first one is a concept that I borrow from Ernst Bloch, and then this is the idea of a temporal multiverse. The multiverse challenges the Western dominant conception of time that we can find in Kant, for example. And I will say something more about that in a second. And this is my first concept, multiverse. And the second concept that I want to introduce in my...
What is it? What's the concept?
Multiverse. Multiverse.
Yeah.
Maybe. Multiverse. And the second concept that I want to introduce is chronoton. This is more a neologism. It's something that I invented. And chronoton means, so chronos, time, ton, tension, is a tension between times. And the chronoton is something that takes place when different temporalities conflict with each other. If you want, is a friction between different temporal layers. Okay, so both chronoton and multiverse, as I said, they challenge the idea of unilinear time. And then I was saying that we can find this idea of a unilinear time and historical time in Kant, for example, because Kant understands time as a condition of possibility of any representation, and he says time cannot be made representable to us except under the image of a line insofar as we draw the line. So basically time, because it's the condition of possibility of the representation of reality together with the space, time cannot be represented. And the only possible representation of time that we have is a line insofar, as Kant says, insofar as we draw the line. This is the only possible representation of time that we can have. So basically, time, or historical time, is like an arrow. And according to the Western representation of historical time, the West is on the tip of the arrow, and that allows us, the Western thought, to say that what is not coherent with the present, with the tip, is something that is backwards or residual, or pre-modern, or pre-capitalist. So basically, any possible qualitative difference is transformed in quantitative difference, in delay. This conception of history and time is at the same time, this is my point, is at the same time a kind of a philosophy of history. And we can see the philosophy, the philosophical implication of this representation of time when we understand, we try to understand the very concept of Weltgeschichte, so universal history or world history. So in that concept that became popular in Germany at the end of the 18th century, in that concept, world history, Weltgeschichte, this Welt, word, is not just a word, it's something universal, something that is a normative for the rest of the world. So basically, when we have pre-capitalist forms or backwards forms, according to the idea of universal history, they have only one possible destiny, and their destiny is to follow the trajectory of the Western historical time. And basically, the West can help them, colonialism, to accelerate their development in order to get out the condition of pre-capitalist or pre-modern societies. I think what we should do is, through the concept of multiversum and chronoton, maybe, we should try to challenge that conception of historical time, in which universal Geschichte, universal history, is a kind of a mechanism that unifies and orders events. So, in my presentation, I want to try to understand or discuss with you two ways in which this conception of historical time and temporality imposed in the political way, the state, and through capitalism. In Marx, primitive accumulation, the problem is how in primitive accumulation the dominant temporality imposes itself as a normative temporality. In that chapter, Marx analyzes the long war against the commons. And in that chapter, what we can find is a list of different temporalities. Basically, each chapter of the section, of the part on primitive accumulation, in each chapter, Marx discusses one specific temporality. For instance, we have the expropriation of the agricultural producers, we have the dissolution of feudal relations, we have enclosures, we have the creation of legal private property rights, we have the Reformation, we have the bloody legislation that is necessary in order to discipline the dispossessed. So the point is that all these temporalities happen in a certain way as a kind of a very chaotic in a very chaotic framework. Althusser would have said, capitalism is the result of an aleatory encounter of these temporalities. What I want to say is, yes, we have these different temporalities, which are in a certain way not they are not teleological oriented, they are random, they are chaotic, but in order to give rise to the capitalist mode of production, my point is they had to be synchronized by a dominant temporality. And in capitalism, that dominant temporality is, on the one hand, the state, on the other hand, is the socially necessary labor time. Marx said, I'm quoting, the rising bourgeoisie needs the power of the state. So I want to put it in a very dramatic way, without the state, no, we don't have the capitalist mode of production. The state was necessary in order to synchronize and organize all these different temporalities. And the state, in a certain way, is basically is a mechanism that is able to synchronize temporalities, is a time machine that puts all these things together, and the result is the capitalist mode of production. So the point is, what state? And my second image is something that I want to borrow from Sieyès in his writing, What is the Third État? And the Sieyès says, I quote, I imagine the law as if it is at the center of an immense globe. Every citizen, without exception, is at an equal distance from the circumference of the globe, and each individual occupies an equal place. Everyone depends equally upon the law. Everyone offers it is a liberty and property to protect. This is what I mean by common rights of citizen. So basically the image that Sieyès provides is like a circle in which the law is at the center and the individual are in the circumference. What the state is doing, the state is synchronizing the temporality of the nation state. The state is imposing the empty homogeneous time of the nation. One language, one community, the big community of the state, one legal system. But that is possible only by destroying pre-existing different temporalities. The temporalities of different communities, different languages, different legal systems. So the state has to destroy commons and collective possession in order to impose a new legal system and a new regime of private property. So what we have in this framework is the center and the circumference, but basically this space is empty. There is nothing in that space. The state has to create a kind of a desert because the state is destroying bodies, corporations, communities, all the different authorities and their different temporalities. The way the state destroys these things is through what I call the process of synchronization. It imposes one single legal system, one regime of private property, and that gives rise to the new homogeneous time of the nation state. So, my point is the state represents a dominant temporality. In capitalism, we can discuss maybe later in the Q&A, but and capitalism requires its own dominant temporality, that it is the socially necessary labor time, that is able to synchronize different markets. So markets, when they are in the global markets, are not longer independent, but they are synchronized by the normative temporality of the socially necessary labor time. But what is interesting, if we try to pay attention of as a capitalism works, is the fact that the capitalism actually encounters pre-existing forms of production, and I'm quoting Marx, and capitalism encounters them as antecedents, but not as antecedents established by capitalism itself, and not as a form of its own life process. So capitalism encounters something that is not produced by capitalism, other forms of production, other social forms. And now I want to point out two issues. The first one is this encounter gives rise to what Harry Ratunian calls an heterogeneous mix rather than the destruction of one by another. So the encounter, when capitalism encounters other temporalities or other social forms, the result is not a destruction. The result is not a new homogeneous space. The result is an heterogeneous mix of different temporalities. My point is, in this heterogeneous mix, we find temporalities in tension with each other and in tension with the dominant temporality, state and socially necessary labor time. This is where the chronotome takes place, in that tension. So there is not just one homogeneous time, we have a mix of temporalities, and between temporalities we have a tension, we have a friction, we have a chronotome. Now, if we change our picture and we don't represent the time in this way as a unilinear time, but as I said, if we assume the temporal multiverse, so instead of seeing time as a line, we have actually, if you want, different trajectories, and between these different historical trajectories, we have tensions. We have what I call chronotome. So the point is we have to try to represent time, and this is something that I'm borrowing from Marx, through the metaphor of a geological strata, in which we have different layers, and these layers they overlap, and there is a tension and friction between layers. So the point is, in that tension, we can see that is the discussion we had before with Gary. In that tension, we can have some possibilities. We can try to think how is possible to orient history and time in a different way. So, if the multiverse is an alternative image that we can provide in order to think time differently, I think what we need is a kind of alternative image for politics as well. So instead of representing the state as a circle in which the surface is empty and all individuals are in the circumference, I think we should try to think politics in a different way, in which instead of the big circle, in which, by the way, universalism is always related to an exclusion, because of that circumference is the border, the limit between what is included and what is excluded. And in the juridical universalism, we can enlarge the circumference, but we still have inclusion and exclusion. So a different representation of that political image can be something like a plurality of units, a plurality of, you can call it communities, assemblies, associations, whatever you want, without a circumference. Something that can enlarge or can be extremely small, but something in which the associations between units is at the stake in politics. Is something that can happen or cannot happen. So the risk of politics is we don't know what is the political dimension of this framework. And we don't know if in that framework there is a tension and conflict between different communities. That is possible. But if we want to neutralize conflict, we have just to buy the image of CA, because in that image there is only one power, and there is the monopoly of power by the state, and the surface is empty. In that other framework, what we have is different units instead of unity. We have units with different temporalities instead of the empty homogeneous time of the nation state. We have a plurality of powers or authorities instead of the monopoly of power by the state. And as I said, there is no such a thing as a circumference that divides between inclusion and exclusion. This model is not a theoretical model, is not abstract. What I'm saying is actually what happened in many historical events. It happened in 1793, French Revolution. It happened in the Paris Commune. It happened at the beginning of the Russian Revolution, where the central power of the state and the unity of the state was challenged by a plurality of different authorities, districts and assemblies in the 1793, before the terror. In the Paris Commune, we had clubs and associations. In the Russian experiment, there were many Soviets with authorities and powers, which limit all the time the centralized power of the state. So, but if we want to take a more recent example, I think this weird image in which we have a plurality of units can be represented by the Zapatistas experiment, when the Zapatistas say, what we want is a world in which many words fit. So if we abandon the unilinear paradigm of historical time and we embrace the multiverse of temporal layers, what we see is this plurality of temporal trajectories which are not backwards, but they express another possible modernity. And I want to give you 3 examples. So the first one is the Zapatistas. In the Zapatistas examples, we have indigenous communities, we have indigenous tradition of self-government, we have a collective possession of land, and we have a plurality of authorities. So the real challenge, what was at stake and what it is at stake in the Zapatistas experiment is that all these things, communities, self-government, and collective possession, and plurality of authorities, all these things challenge the logic of the state, the logic of the monopoly of the state, the monopoly of power, the logic of private property, and the logic of individual atomization. So they think in terms of communities and collective rights instead of individual rights. So what they want to say is that if we abandon the unilinear representation of time, we cannot call these indigenous traditions or indigenous communities romantic or backwards. Because what they represent is the reactivation of other forms of democracy and possession, that reactivation that takes place in the chronoton, in the tension between temporality. So I want to be very clear about that. So when we have a tension, so let's see this line as the dominant temporality of the state and the dominant temporality of a modernity. The indigenous trajectory is not backward because we have a different framework in which we have a multiverse of temporality, a plurality of trajectories. What we have to say is not that we choose the indigenous trajectory instead of the dominant temporality of the state, or the dominant temporality of the state instead of the indigenous trajectory. The decision is not between temporality 1 and 2. The point is that when they conflict, there is a tension and a friction between them. And the point is that in that tension, we have a kind of a field of possibilities in which modernity and the trajectory of modernity can be reoriented. And this is, in my understanding, what the Zapatistas are doing in Chiapas, in Mexico. So they are not trying to destroy the state and the constitution. So basically, it's quite the opposite. They are trying to reform the constitution by claiming articles which cannot fit in the constitution. And this is the challenge, this is the tension. This is the way they try to orient modernity in a different direction. More historical examples are possible. For example, I think this is the way Marx understood the Russian Commune in Russia, when, for example, Vera Zasulich in 1881 asked Marx his opinion about the future of the peasant commune. And Vera Zasulich said, we often hear that is said that the rural commune is an archaic form, condemned to perish by history. And then she said, the people who say that, they call themselves Marxists. And Marx has to say, basically I disagree with the Marxists, because I don't think that the Russian commune has to perish. He said in his answer, my book, Capital, provides no reasons either for or against the vitality of the Russian commune. But the special study I have made of it, of the Russian commune, has convinced me that the commune is the fulcrum for social regeneration in Russia. So Marx is not saying we embrace the rural commune, but is not saying we embrace capitalist development in Russia. Marx is saying in that tension between the rural commune and the dominant temporality and capitalism, we have other possibilities. And we have to play with that field of possibilities. A similar example can be the Paris Commune, in which I think the communards were playing in a similar way with the time when they reactivated medieval institutions, and they were aware of that. They said, yes, we know imperative mandate is a kind of medieval institutions, but it's the way we want to reorganize a self-government in a political trajectory that is not the one of the modern state. So, my point is always what can happen in that tension when we don't choose either the dominant temporality or the romantic alternative. And I think this is what we can understand if we abandon the unilinear historical paradigm and we try to think anachronism not as something obsolete or residual, but forms that can show us a different trajectory. And that trajectories, these trajectories are possible in the tension that we have between temporalities. So in that mix of temporalities, in that heterogeneous mix of temporalities that takes place when capitalism encounters different forms of production, we have we can disclose many different political and social alternatives. Yeah, and I want to conclude just by saying, going back to Russia, this is really my conclusion in 2 words. So the alternative in Russia was, if you want, between the capitalist development on the one hand, that by the way was imposed through Roman law, and the other possibility that was the Russian Commune and their hostility to the introduction of Roman law in Russia, especially the socialist revolutionaries. So if you want to take political parties, you had on the one hand Plekhanov and the early Lenin that brought in his book The Development of Capitalism in Russia, 1899, the Commune basically is just rephrasing Plekhanov when he says the Commune is an obsolete institution that provokes a tremendous delay in the social development. So that trajectory was the trajectory of the West. And the political problem was the delay of Russia and the attempt to catch up with the Western modernization. On the other hand, there were the socialist revolutionaries, which had a very nice understanding of history when they said, for example, history is like a building with many rooms, and the light can enter from different windows. So they had the idea of history as a building, and the fact that it's a vertical is very interesting because it's not just a unilinear time. It's a building, there are many windows, and the light that can enter from different windows means that there is not only one trajectory. So progress is not only in one direction, but the development and future is open to different trajectories and possibilities. So that was my presentation.